The experiment in the attic. The house stood at the edge of the moors, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. Its windows were dark, its walls overgrown with ivy, and its roof sagged under the weight of time. To Eleanor Graves, it was both a prison and a sanctuary, a place she had avoided for years, yet one she could no longer ignore. Her father, the reclusive Dr. Alistair Graves, had passed away a fortnight ago, leaving her as the sole heir to his estate. Now, she stood before the heavy oak door, clutching the iron key in her trembling hand. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of decay. Eleanor coughed as she stepped into the foyer, her boots echoing on the cracked marble floor. The house was exactly as she remembered it, cold, lifeless, and filled with shadows. She had spent her childhood here, though it had never felt like a home. Her father had been a distant figure, consumed by his work and rarely seen outside his study or the attic. Even now, years later, she could not shake the feeling that the house was watching her, as though it harbored secrets too terrible to speak aloud. She spent the first day sorting through her father's belongings, his books, his papers, his strange collection of artifacts from distant lands. It was in his study that she found the journal, its leather cover worn, and its pages yellowed with age. The entries were written in her father's precise hand, detailing his experiments and theories on the nature of life and death. Eleanor skimmed the pages, her heart pounding as she read words like immortality, reanimation, and the elixir of life. It was the final entry that caught her attention. The experiment is nearly complete. The subject shows signs of vitality, though the transformation is not yet stable. I must proceed with caution, for the consequences of failure are too grave to contemplate. If I succeed, I shall unlock the greatest mystery of all, the secret to eternal life. But if I fail, God help us all. Eleanor's breath quickened as she closed the journal. Her father had always been eccentric, but this was madness. What had he been trying to achieve? And what had become of his experiment? Her eyes drifted to the ceiling, where a narrow staircase led to the attic. She had never been allowed up there as a child. Her father had always insisted it was too dangerous. Now, with the journal in hand, she felt a strange compulsion to see it for herself. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed, the air growing colder with each step. The attic door was locked, but the key from her father's study fit perfectly. She turned it slowly, the mechanism clicking open with a sound that echoed through the silent house. The attic was a labyrinth of shadows, its low ceiling supported by wooden beams that seemed to groan under the weight of the roof. Dust motes danced in the pale light that filtered through a single grime-covered window. The room was filled with strange contraptions, glass tubes, copper coils, and jars of murky liquid that glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room stood a large table, its surface stained with dark, rust-colored patches. Eleanor's eyes were drawn to a figure in the corner, partially concealed by a tattered sheet. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. With a trembling hand, she pulled the sheet away and stifled a scream. It was a body, or rather, what had once been a body. The figure was human in shape, but its skin was pale and waxy, its limbs stiff and unnatural. Its eyes were closed, its lips slightly parted, as though it were in a deep sleep. But what horrified Eleanor most was the faint rise and fall of its chest. It was breathing. She stumbled back, her mind racing. This was impossible. Her father's experiments. They could not have succeeded. And yet the evidence was before her, undeniable and grotesque. She returned to the journal, flipping through the pages with frantic urgency. There, in her father's meticulous handwriting, were the details of his work. He had sought to create a serum that could halt death itself, using a combination of chemicals and electrical currents to reanimate dead tissue. The subject, a cadaver obtained through dubious means, had shown signs of life, but the process was unstable. The reanimated body was prone to violent outbursts, its mind fractured and its instincts primal. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the final entry again. The subject is no longer under my control. It has become something else, something monstrous. I have locked it away, but I fear it is only a matter of time before it breaks free. If you are reading this, Eleanor, know that I am sorry. I never meant for you to discover this. Destroy the serum, burn the notes, and whatever you do not let it out. She looked up at the figure in the corner, her stomach churning with dread. It had not moved, but she could feel its presence, a suffocating weight in the air. She had to destroy it, the serum, the notes, everything. But as she turned to leave, a sound stopped her in her tracks, a low, guttural groan. Eleanor froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly she turned back to the figure. Its eyes were open now, glowing with a faint, unnatural light. Its head tilted to one side, its lips curling into a grotesque imitation of a smile. "Eleanor," it rasped, its voice a hollow echo of her father's. She screamed, dropping the journal as she stumbled toward the door. But the figure was faster. It lunged at her, its movements jerky and unnatural, its hands clawing at the air. She slammed the attic door shut, locking it just as the thing on the other side began to pound against the wood. Her heart raced as she fled down the stairs, her mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. She had to get out of the house, to call for help. But as she reached the foyer, she realized with growing horror that the front door was locked, and the key was gone. The pounding from the attic grew louder, the sound reverberating through the house. Eleanor sank to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had always feared her father's work, but she had never imagined it would come to this. Now, trapped in the house with the thing he had created, she understood the true cost of his ambition. And as the attic door splintered open, she knew there was no escape. The curse of the silent sea. The sea was a merciless mistress, her waves crashing against the hull of the mariner's fortune like the fists of a wrathful god. Captain Elias Hargrove stood at the helm, his weathered face illuminated by the pale light of a waning moon. He had spent a lifetime chasing fortune across the oceans, but tonight he had found something far more valuable and far more dangerous. In the hold of the ship lay the relic, a golden trident, encrusted with barnacles and glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. It had been recovered from the wreck of a sunken galleon, its crew long since claimed by the depths. The crew of the mariner's fortune had celebrated their discovery, but Elias felt a gnawing unease as he gazed upon the trident. It seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though it were alive. That night, as the crew slept, Elias heard it, a faint melodic whisper emanating from the relic. It called to him, promising wealth beyond his wildest dreams. Greed overpowered his fear, and he took the trident for himself, hiding it in his quarters. The next morning, the sea was unnaturally calm. The waves no longer crashed against the ship. The wind no longer howled through the sails. Even the cries of the gulls had ceased. The world had fallen into an eerie, oppressive silence. At first, the crew marveled at their newfound fortune. The trident seemed to bring them luck, guiding them to uncharted islands filled with treasure. But as the days turned to weeks, the silence began to wear on them. The absence of sound became a weight, pressing down on their minds until they could bear it no longer. One by one, the crew succumbed to madness. Some threw themselves into the sea, desperate to escape the silence. Others turned on each other, their screams swallowed by the void. Elias watched in horror as his men fell, their eyes wide with terror, their voices forever lost. Alone on the ship, Elias clung to the trident, his only companion in the suffocating silence. He tried to rid himself of it, tossing it into the sea, but it always returned, appearing in his quarters as though it had never left. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with visions of drowned sailors and sunken cities. One night, as the moon hung low in the sky, Elias stood at the bow of the ship, the trident in his hands. The whispers had become a deafening roar, drowning out his thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self. He knew there was only one way to end the curse. With a final desperate cry, he plunged the trident into his chest. The sea remained silent as Elias's body sank beneath the waves, the trident still clutched in his hands. The ship drifted aimlessly, a ghostly vessel adrift in an endless, soundless expanse. And in the depths below, the trident glowed brighter, its whispers echoing through the darkness, waiting for the next soul to claim. The last breath of Dr. Graves. The laboratory was a tomb of glass and steel, illuminated only by the cold, flickering light of a dying storm outside. Dr. Elias Graves sat hunched over his workbench, his skeletal fingers trembling as they adjusted the final wires of his creation. The machine loomed before him, a grotesque amalgamation of brass, gears, and glowing tubes, pulsating faintly like a mechanical heart. It was his magnum opus, a device capable of preserving the human mind beyond the frail confines of the body. But time was running out. Elias coughed violently, his handkerchief stained crimson. The consumption had ravaged his lungs, leaving him a shadow of the man he once was. He knew he had mere days, perhaps hours, left to live. Yet he refused to succumb to death's cold embrace, not when he was so close to conquering it. Just a little longer, he whispered to himself, his voice a raspy echo in the empty room. Just a little longer, and I shall be free. With a final, shuddering breath, Elias activated the machine. The gears whirred to life, and the tubes glowed brighter, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He lay back in the chair, his body frail and broken, and placed the metallic crown upon his head. The machine hummed, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through his very soul. Then, darkness. When Elias opened his eyes, he was no longer in the laboratory. He stood in a vast, endless void, devoid of light or sound. Panic surged through him as he realized he could no longer feel his body. No heartbeat, no breath, no warmth. He was nothing but a consciousness, adrift in an infinite abyss. Is this eternity? He wondered, his voice echoing in the emptiness. But then, the void began to change. Shapes emerged from the darkness, twisted, grotesque forms that writhed and pulsed like living shadows. They whispered to him, their voices a cacophony of despair and madness. You cannot escape, Elias. Death is not the end. You are trapped. Elias tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows closed in around him, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. He realized with mounting horror that this was not the immortality he had envisioned. This was a prison, a nightmare from which there was no escape. Back in the laboratory, the machine continued to hum, its lights flickering erratically. The body of Dr. Graves lay motionless in the chair, his eyes wide and unseeing. The storm outside had passed, leaving the room in silence.